It is my great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Reed Phillips, who I've known for many years. Reed is the founder of Desilver and Phillips, one of the co-founders of it, which is, in my opinion, the leading mergers and acquisitions firm in the traditional and digital media space. I'll kind of cut through this a little, but he's been involved with Morris. He has been involved with Time Inc., with Shamrock, with Rodale, with News Corp, and many large companies and smaller companies in terms of the buying and selling of magazines. What I particularly find intriguing about Reed is the fact that he came out of this business. He was an entrepreneur. He founded what I think is one of the best idea magazines, which was Father's back. He ran the New Republic and several other Washingtonian magazines. And then he started this company. He's constantly quoted in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. He's on CBS, NBC, and so on. Reed, if I were to buy or sell a magazine or a magazine company, or maybe even an independent media rep firm, you would be who I would go to always.
Thank you, Jim.
With that said, your topic is how magazine publishers are creating value for their companies in a digital age. I think we just saw an example of a company that has done a wonderful job in that. But let me start by asking you a couple of questions. Your subject suggests that magazine publishers are no longer creating value the old-fashioned way by publishing magazines. Is that what is happening?
Yeah, it is, Jim, to a large extent. Before I really get into talking about that, I wanted to just add what Jim said, which is I started my career in magazine publishing. So the first 10 years, I was in magazine publishing before getting into investment banking. And a lot of the work I do in investment banking is focused on magazines also. So I'm a big advocate of magazines, and like to think of myself as a champion of magazines. When I talk to you today about what we see going on in the investment world around magazines and the value of magazines, think of me as a journalist kind of reporting to you and telling you kind of what we're seeing. These are not the direction that the industry's gone in terms of value in the last 5 years isn't necessarily the direction that I would like to have seen it go in, but it nevertheless is the direction that it's gone in. To start off, in answering Jim's question, will say that magazines are valued based on their profitability, and that's defined as EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And that started about 25 years ago when Time Warner in their annual report came out and said that's how we're now going to define our profitability. So that's how investors look at value, and if strategic magazine companies are looking at buying other magazine companies, that's kind of the rule of thumb in terms of figuring out how much a magazine business is worth. 5 years ago, we were seeing magazine businesses worth 8 to 10 times EBITDA. So if your business was making $1 million, it was worth 8 to 10 million. Today, the value for magazines, and this is again primarily print magazines, not adding a lot of other things. If you're just looking purely at a magazine business that sells subscriptions, newsstand sales, drives advertising revenue in their print editions, we're seeing the values in the range of 4 to 5 times. So it's about half what it was 5 years ago. And there are a number of reasons for that we'll get into, but that's kind of the landscape in terms of what we're seeing right now.
How did magazines create value before the digital age?
Magazines became very attractive to outside investors in the industry, private equity investors, starting maybe 15 years ago. And the attributes that magazines have that make them so attractive are Number one, they don't require a lot of investments. There's not a lot of capital that would go into buying, say, printing presses if you were in the printing business, because you don't have those costs. And you have recurring revenue coming from subscriptions. You have, you also have, very kind of predictable revenue. You have, coming from your advertisers and newsstand sales and your subscribers. So the business was viewed as an attractive business. You also, for your subscriptions, were getting money ahead of having to deliver the product. So again, another thing that was attractive. And so all those things combined meant that other magazine publishers and investors wanted to buy these businesses. And that was really starting 15 years ago, when the prices really got ramped up into the kind of 8 to 10 times range. And everything kind of went along smoothly until really about 5 years ago, when Lehman Brothers went under, when we got hit by the economic downturn. And at that point, things started to change. And the reason they changed is because a lot of the magazines lost as much as 30–40% of their revenues from advertising. The advertising declined. At the same time, there were other issues going on in terms of the transition to digital.
Can you give some more concrete examples of things in the past where there was great evaluation?
Yeah, and one important thing to add is a lot of the companies that were in magazine publishing that were valued very highly up until, say, 5 years ago were valued that way because they did what you saw earlier from Mr. Morris and Donna. They expanded their platforms, and they weren't just in magazine publishing. They were hosting events and doing all kinds of other things. And that added to the value, particularly from private equity investors. Private equity investors don't like to see, they like to view a company that they acquire almost like a stock portfolio. They don't want all the eggs in one basket coming just from, say, advertising. They want to see that, in print magazines, they want to see that there's revenue from events, and that you're taking your platform and extending it, and as far as you can into a number of other areas. So there were really great examples of companies getting sold. We were involved in a company that was sold called Hanley Wood. They're a B2B publisher, but they have an event called The World of Concrete that was extremely profitable. And that business sold for $618 million. And was sold north of 10 times EBITDA. So there are a number of examples like that. F&W is a media company that owned magazines and book publishing. They were sold for close to 10 times EBITDA. So it was a very robust time.
So what happened to cause this magazine valuations to decline so much? And is there any hope here? Can this loss in value be regained at some point? Or was it always maybe too high?
Well, I think, if I look back at the reasons why, and really, again, I'm going back to 5 years ago, you guys may remember that there were magazines, really in the last 5 years that were, brands that you guys all know, TV Guide, Newsweek, Business Week. These were brands that were incredibly powerful. They were worth a lot of money. I like to use the Business Week example because McGraw-Hill owned Business Week. 10 years before they sold it to Bloomberg for $5 million, they turned down an offer for $1 billion. And so you can just see the kind of loss in value. And the biggest loss is occurring really with the news weeklies. That's where the biggest hit was occurring. But when we looked at Business Week for a buyer, and it was losing a substantial amount of money, which is the reason it only sold for $5 million. So the fact that those were highly publicized deals, and other magazine publishers and investors saw that going on, gave them a lot of pause in terms of being interested in buying magazine businesses. Second factor is, with that dramatic drop in revenues that occurred, a lot of the companies that were bought by private equity firms were in default. So the private equity firms, when they buy a business and it has $10 million in EBITDA and say they paid 10 times $100 million for it, roughly half of the money is put up in equity. They borrow the other half from lenders. The lenders then are saying, well, as long as you continue to maintain your EBITDA of 10 million, maybe it can slide a little bit, you're going to be in our good graces. But as soon as, if it drops dramatically to like 5 million, you're in trouble. And these companies were defaulting, they were being restructured, and the owners, the equity owners were being completely wiped out. So their 50 million was gone, and now the lenders were the owners of these businesses. So that was another kind of strike against magazines. The third strike was that while all this was happening, there was the digital transition, and so magazine publishers were finding, they were aware that the value of magazines were going down, and I'm talking, publishers like Condé Nast, Meredith, all the Penton Media. So they in terms of shifting to digital, they didn't want to buy magazines. So if we went to market with a magazine, say 2 years ago, we were hard pressed to find a private equity buyer or a strategic buyer, and that continues to be the case today. The strategic buyers, their viewpoint is, well, we don't want to buy more magazines because I've already got like 20 magazines. I'm trying to kind of reposition my company so it looks more digital, and I want to buy events, and I want to buy things that are not magazines. And so basically what's happened is the kind of rule of supply and demand, there's much less demand for buying magazines today than there was 5 years ago. And so that's kind of dampened the valuations. And a lot of times when we look for buyers of magazines today, we're looking for kind of contrarian buyers. It's very much like the newspaper industry with Warren Buffett coming in and buying papers. Well, he's buying papers now, newspapers, not because he's a big fan of newspapers. He's buying them at 4 times EBITDA when they used to be worth 8 to 10 times EBITDA.
Is he doing that because he thinks there'll be a increase in that at some point in advertising revenues and so on, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. What he's doing, I think, is he has said very clearly, I'm not buying any large metro papers because those are vulnerable to competition from the internet. And so he's not buying the Washington Post like Jeff Bezos did. And what he's doing is he's buying local community papers that rely on that content and information, and he doesn't see that going away. So he believes there's a long-term business there, and I think, of course, he thinks that it may continue to migrate to digital.
Well, now that we're firmly in the digital age, right, what can magazine publishers do to increase their value?
What we're seeing in terms of what publishers are currently doing, particularly the ones that know that they're going to have to go to market and sell their businesses in the next couple of years, is diversifying. So they're doing really 2 things. They're diversifying away from print, so they're not totally reliant on print. And the second thing is they're transforming their business to digital. So those are the 2 key things, and we see it all over the place with publishers. When we look at a company like F&W Media, they're a consumer magazine publisher, book publisher. They've repositioned themselves. They're now calling themselves the Amazon of their verticals, and they're becoming more of an e-commerce company. We helped them buy a company, and when they wanted to buy something, they said, well, we want to buy something that's 100% e-commerce. We don't want print right now unless it's really at an attractive price, but we'll step up and pay for something that's e-commerce, because at the time, the revenues, when we were working with them about 1.5 years ago, the revenues for coming from e-commerce were starting to approach about 15-20% of the company's overall revenues.
You, when we were talking last week or the week before in New York, you also said within that same question to kind of stay away from businesses that are vulnerable to internet startups. Can you chat about that a bit?
Yeah, that's certainly easier to say than to do, but a good example, I think, is we did some work about 10 years ago with some companies that were in the business of supplying photos to advertisers and publishers. And back then, companies like Getty could charge $300 for an image. Well, now there are upstart internet companies like Shutterstock that sell images for 50 cents or $1. And that's just completely disrupted that industry. So I think when, as publishers, when you look to extend your businesses, the first place to look is, look to your advertisers and look to your readers and have them help direct you on which directions to go in, because that's the strongest base that you have in terms of relationships. That may take you into video, and just recently Condé Nast has announced that they're going to have a television program for each of their magazines. And Esquire just came out with the Esquire network. So there's a lot of innovation going on, and that's what magazine publishers need to be doing. They need to be examining video and really looking at a lot of different ways to take what they currently have, but generate new revenue streams. One of the clients that I recently worked with was a B2B publisher, Moose River. And Moose River had magazines on landscaping. They acquired a number of years ago a internet business that basically was an online community for landscapers, so that landscapers all around the U.S. could go online and compare notes about lawnmowers and all kinds of things. And when all this was occurring, my client then started selling advertising against it. And by the time we sold Moose River, half the earnings were from the community site, where they were generating 70% margins. So it was a highly profitable business, but a very natural extension of what they were currently doing.
One of the examples that we talked about was Ziff. Can you talk just a bit about that, and also a little bit about Prime Media?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Those are two good examples of companies that really made dramatic transformations. Ziff Davis Media, years ago, they were the guys who published the computer magazines, and they had fallen kind of on hard times. The company got sold to a private equity buyer, Great Hill Partners, for $25 million. And an executive of Vivek Shah from Time Inc. came in with an idea about how to transform the business. And his concept was to shift completely away from print, 100% digital, and work with advertisers from print, but work with them as partners in trying to help them sell more product. And his company was just acquired 3 years after he bought it for $25 million for $167 million by an internet company, J2 Global. And they paid 3 times revenue, which is an extraordinary price. It's really the kind of price that digital media companies are getting. And then in the case of Prime Media, that's actually a really good example, because the market that got hit the hardest in the last 5 years in media is anything associated with real estate. Prime Media was providing guides to homes that were for sale and apartments for rent. And so they got crushed during the downturn. What they did, though, which was very clever, is they during that time they really shifted away from print and shifted entirely to digital. So they were still doing the things they were doing in print for their real estate brokers. They were providing leads, people that might be interested in buying homes or renting apartments. And when they accomplished all of this, they later sold their business. It was just in the last year and a half, and they were able to sell the business for 8 times EBITDA, over $500 million, to a private equity player. So they were able to sell a business. Some of their competitors who haven't made the transition are they're actually trying to sell their companies, are having a hard time, and the multiples are kind of in the five times range.
We've been talking so far about large companies like Morris or Condé Nast or other such companies, but some of us in the room have smaller companies. What should smaller publishers with less resources be doing and focusing on?
I think the key is experiment and be willing to try things and fail, a lot of trial and error. But again, do things that are closest to what you're already doing, working with your advertisers, working with your readers and subscribers, newsstand buyers, using that as the base. But we see a lot of small publishers doing very innovative things. August Home Publishing is in Des Moines. They're a consumer magazine publisher. They were very frustrated that when they were looking to put all of their publications both on digital, mobile, and make them available across a whole platform, they were frustrated they couldn't find a way to do it that they thought was right for them. What they did is they created their own software. What was kind of astounding about that is that now that they're happy with that, they actually see a business in licensing their software to other publishers.
It sort of sounds like there's not just one formula for everybody, right?
Right.
So you have to do a bunch of stuff. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
You absolutely have to try a lot of things, and you have to do what's right for your magazine. You can't. We've recently heard that there's a publishing company that I know fairly well, and they've just decided they want to go into the e-commerce business. I don't really see the logic in it. I don't see the connection from the kinds of magazines they publish and going into e-commerce. I would see it more if they were like a magazine focused on the latest fashion and showing all kinds of products and then allowing you to buy those products easily and seamlessly, but that's not the kind of business they're in. So we're starting to see some publishers doing that, really just maybe in some cases grasping at straws. They're still experimenting, which is terrific. But I know David Carey, who's the CEO at Hearst Magazines, their new motto inside the company is fail fast. So the idea is try something, but if it's not going to work, move on and try something else. Don't stick with it for too long. We see other publishers that are doing interesting things. I talked about F&W. When he shifted into becoming an e-commerce business, the Amazon for his verticals, he had to replace a lot of his staff, and he had to bring in e-commerce experts. Whereas we see another company, Access Intelligence in Maryland, and Access Intelligence did something very different. They decided to retrain their current staff to make them more focused and capable in digital and social media and those areas, and that strategy has been effective. But in terms of my thoughts about more in the area that we're in, acquisitions and that sort of thing. We have seen a lot of publishers, and Ziff was a good example, that use acquisitions to transform their business. There are other ways to do it too. Internal development, I talked about August Home and how they developed their own software. And the other way that we're seeing that's being used now is partnerships and collaborations. And earlier I mentioned Hanley Wood and their World of Concrete show. That's a US-centric show. Just today I saw that they announced they partnered with a European firm to take World of Concrete to Europe.
That's terrific. We have about five minutes left, a little bit more, and I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions for Reed. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Well, in that case, let me take a few more minutes, and because we cut through some of this. You were describing tactics in search of a strategy, and so the reverse of that is a strategy, right? How would you recommend to smaller publishers that they actually create a strategy and then experiment and get out of these things quicker? What's the process by which to do something like that?
That's a good question. You know what I think we see, and again, it's smaller publishers are more constrained by their resources, but what we like to see when we go out and talk to companies, and particularly ones that maybe we're selling, is that they're trying 4 or 5 things at a time. Maybe they're getting into video, maybe they're doing something really interesting in social media. And again, my mindset when I'm talking to a publishing company is, how are they increasing their value? And if we take them to market, what's the likelihood that we can sell the company? So when we worked with Moose River, we were very attracted to the fact that they had this online community and half of their earnings were coming from that, because we knew that would resonate with buyers. It was actually a business that we sold to EBSCO Industries. EBSCO has a publishing unit called Grandview, and they bought it for their publishing unit because they thought, well, we can then replicate those communities across our other magazines. So that we knew that that would be considered very attractive.
Last night we were talking, and I'd asked you, or someone asked you, what a digital marketing company might go for, compared to the 5 or 6 for magazines, what a digital marketing company might do.
Yeah, you know, for digital, you know, it depends on the area of digital, but multiples go up to kind of 15, 20 times EBITDA, so they can really be substantial. You know, there's a wide range depending on the type of digital company. It could be 10 times, it could be 20, and what we've seen really is some of the companies that are not even making money, they're still valued very highly, and they're valued off of their revenues, and they're valued that way because everyone believes that they're, you know, soon going to make a lot of money.
Up here.
Yes, sir.
Morning, Reed. How you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
So we print for Moose River, as you probably know, because you
Yep.
did the book on it, and I think you were at last week's Media Next
Yep.
the Folio 100 breakfast, and you probably listened with great attention to what Rance Crane said initially when he was brought up to the stage, and then I'm sure you listened to Andy's keynote address. And the message that they were trying to give, I think, had a lot to do with building and innovating in digital, using your print product as a cornerstone for that growth.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a numbers guy and a projection guy, do you think Moose River would have been able to develop that online community without starting with a print cornerstone to their business? And relative to your comments on the valuations of digital only, could you sort of rectify the imbalance there? I mean, could Moose River have delivered the value that they did without starting with print? Because you said that most of the value in that deal was on the digital stuff, not on the print.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that, and I should have pointed that out or made it more clear earlier, but Moose River was able to add a lot of value because they have a large audience already of landscapers. So they were able to, in buying the digital business, they were able to promote it in the magazine, and they were able to do things with it that no one else could have done with it. A pure digital company couldn't have done what they did with it. And they also, remember, had all the relationships with the advertisers. So the guy who started it, the entrepreneur on the digital side, he was, you know, able to make pretty good progress, but the business became much more profitable and a much better business under Moose River's ownership. And it's a business where it can become, you know, even more valuable. That business can grow, you know, by 5 times in the next 5 or 10 years, I would guess, on the digital side.
We have another question.
When you're looking at acquiring a property, are you looking at percentages within the platforms? For example, about a month ago we were at an event where the CEO of Meredith pointed out that their digital revenue is only about 2%.
Right.
But overall they're a healthy company because of their licensing agreements and various other revenue streams. When you're looking at it, how do you go about determining what's a healthy mix between print, digital, et cetera?
Okay. I'll give you an answer on that. what we're finding is, and this is the frustrating part of the whole thing, I thought that tablets would be kind of a magic bullet for the magazine industry, because tablets would allow the magazines to cut out the post office, and they wouldn't have to print, they wouldn't have to pay for the paper, and then they'd become much more profitable. And if there was a good migration to tablets, investors would become interested again. The migration's been really slow. When I talk to a lot of the big publishers, they're under 10% in terms of penetration. A lot of times it's 5% with digital. And so that's been disappointing. Hopefully that'll improve. If it does improve, it'll dramatically increase the value of magazines. But what I find from investors, and it's even worse, when we were out with a company recently, and it was they were doing a great job. They were 50% digital, and we were promoting that. We got a lot of people complaining, saying, well, we don't want to buy print. And so I would go back and say, well, this is 50% digital, 50% print. They're making a great transition. How much digital do you need to get comfortable? And some of the answers were 90%. You want 90% digital, 10% print. And it just shows you that there's a lot of anxiety among the investors in terms of being concerned about print, just because of what they've seen in the last 5 years.
Samir, do we have time for one more question?
If I ask, I'll ask the question, because we ran out of time. It used to be like your magazines will acquire value after 2-3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Is this still true for people who are publishing new magazines? Does it take 2-3 years, or it's now 10 years before you have any value in your product?
It's going to be closer to 10 years, unfortunately. It's going to be a lot longer. Because buyers aren't going to scoop up magazines that just look like they're taking off and doing well. They're going to want to see that you've proven that you can make a lot of money and do it for a couple of years.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, John.